Hey, thanks for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure as you step in to hit the like button. It's really appreciated. I thank you so much. I really, really appreciate this. I'm just so grateful to be able to come on live this evening. As you know, if you don't know, ladies and gentlemen, we're in the middle of a huge snowstorm here in New York. We could end up actually having 2 feet of snow, which does not really happen here in New York City. It does happen in Buffalo. It does happen in Rochester. It happens in Binghamton, like the upstate parts of New York. The closer you get, obviously, to Canada, of course, listen, those places can see like 3 to 4 feet of snow when it gets really, really bad. But here in New York, not so much. But I like to think that we're prepared for it. This new mayor did a terrible job during the first regular snowstorm. In fact, in case you guys don't know, there were about 34 people who perished during that snowstorm in New York. So let's hope that he does a much better job here. And obviously not all of that is his fault, but some of it is. And he did a poor job as far as I'm concerned when it comes to preparedness during a snowstorm. But I digress. And I pray for those who are caught in the middle of a snowstorm. I pray that they're able to find shelter, get shelter, and that they're okay. But here we are once again talking about Steelers. Now I'm talking about Steelers Black History. And I want to do a special tribute to one of my Steeler heroes, Mike Wagner, who passed away during this week at the age of 76. But normally we would start with football players when it comes to Steelers Black History. But I do want to do a special tribute to a guy who often gets overlooked. Hey, Misunderstood, how are you? And thank you for joining. Thank you so much. And there's a guy in Steelers history who really doesn't get talked about enough as far as I'm concerned. And he really is one of the backbones of the reason why the Steel Curtain came about. And his name is Bill Nunn. Now, you're going to hear that name a couple of times. And so I will have to say Bill Nunn Sr. and Bill Nunn Jr. Bill Nunn Jr. was Radio Raheem in Do the Right Thing, and he was an actor in many, many films. That's why I have to differentiate the two. Bill Nunn Sr., however, was the backbone of one of the reasons why the Pittsburgh Steelers became the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I'll explain why. See, back in the early 70s, scouting wasn't like the way it is now. And to be quite honest, HBCUs were very, very misrepresented or not represented at all back in the day. So Bill Nunn was a journalist for many, many years. And he started the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a Black-owned magazine dealing mainly with Black issues. Now, since he was a sports writer for that publication, he had very vast knowledge of that. In fact, they had something that used to be called the Black College All-America team, and he started that in 1950. Now, he scouted many, many players, and he was most responsible for getting guys like Mel Blount, John Stallworth, and Donnie Shell. We all know those three men are in the Hall of Fame right now. And this was absolutely, hey, 420 Virgo, how are you? This was absolutely due to Bill Nunn's. In fact, here's the best story, because John Stallworth could have been taken by anybody else, but here's the thing with that. Stallworth, we all know, and listen, I'm a Lynn Swann fan. That's my guy, and so is John. John Stallworth's my guy too. But I was wanting to be Lynn Swann when I was a kid, but I digress. But I'll be the first to admit that John Stallworth was much faster than Swann, much faster. Swann was the better route runner. Stallworth was the smoother route runner, but Swann was better. But I digress. Stallworth's 40 time was on a wet track, and a lot of people were disappointed with the results, so they thought that Stallworth was going to be slower than what he really was. But Nunn was the smart one, and he was the only scout to stay the next day and watch Stallworth run his regular time. Stallworth ran a 4.3. I think, if I'm not mistaken, at that time he ran like a 4.6, 4.7. And he was the smartest one. He kept that footage to himself. And he made sure to share that with the Steeler brass. In fact, he worked as the Steeler scout from 1970 to 1987. He also helped us get Mean Joe Green and people of that ilk. Because, see, what he did was form sort of a pipeline, so to speak, with the Steelers, the same way the college recruiters have a pipeline with certain states. That's what Bill Nunn did with the black HBCUs, of course. And that gave us Mean Joe Green in 1969, which was Chuck Noll's very first draft pick. Got us, in fact, the entire front four, which was the original Steel Curtain. And let me clear that up for the real Steeler fans in the building. Now, because over time that's happened, the Steel Curtain has included the entire defense. But if you go back to the original Time magazine article, and you can Google it, look it up, the Steel Curtain really consisted of the front four. The Steelers played a 4-3 defense back in the day. And the front four, of course, consisted of the legendary Mean Joe Green, the should be in the Hall of Fame L.C. Greenwood, that's a joke, Dwight White, and Ernie Holmes. Those are really the Steel Curtain, those four guys. In fact, they were termed a half a ton of trouble. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, they were the first front four that was put on Time magazine's front cover. That's how great they were. But now, of course, it's encompassed the entire defense. And that's what happens when you win 4 Super Bowls in 6 years, which is exactly what the 70s Steelers did. Bill Nunn, as I mentioned, worked for the Steelers until 1987, which was ironically, no, it was Chuck Noll's last year in the playoffs was 1988. I'll take that back, because I remember he, if I'm not mistaken, they beat the Houston Oilers in the first round of the playoffs, and then they lost to Denver in the second round. And that was Bubby Brister who was the quarterback, but I digress. Without Bill Nunn, there's no Steeler dynasty, because those are core players. When you think of what those guys did, Mel Blount, we have the Mel Blount rule, of course, because he was such a physical corner. He changed the way corners played football. And ironically, Mel Blount was a Pro Bowler more times after the Mel Blount rule than during the Meltdown. John Stallworth also is in Canton, right next to his mate Lynn Swann. Donnie Shell was a free agent signee in 1974. That 1974 draft class is the greatest draft class in NFL history, what the Steelers did. When you think about the Hall of Famers in that draft class, Lynn Swann was the first pick. The second pick was Jack Lambert. If I'm not mistaken, the third pick was Mike Webster. The fourth pick was John Stallworth. All four of those guys are in Canton. And the fifth guy in Canton was a free agent named Donnie Shell. And Donnie Shell had many of his best seasons after the championship seasons. A testament to his legacy and his longevity. That's how great a player Donnie Shell was. And that's among many others that the Steelers have gotten. So I had to put that out there as far as Bill Nunn, because his contributions are so often overlooked when it comes to the Pittsburgh Steelers and their dynasty. Without him, there is no dynasty, as I mentioned before. Now I get to mention the players, and I did mention just a few of them just now. But the very first Steeler Hall of Famer was a fullback by the name of John Henry Johnson, the first Steeler Black Hall of Famer. Let me preface that. I apologize. Ernie Stoutner was the very first Pittsburgh Hall of Famer, first Steeler Hall of Famer. And he was a great defensive tackle. But John Henry Johnson was a Hall of Famer during a very terrible time in Steelers history. And let's face it, the Steelers in the 50s and 60s were terrible. I'm not even going to sit up here and make any excuses. They were a bad football team for many, many years. It's not until Chuck Noll got there that the Steelers became the Steelers that we know and love of today. And it took him a while to get there also, because from 1969 to, I'll say 1971, the first 3 years were not great, but you could see that they were making progress. Then all of that changed with their very first pick in 1972. His name was Franco Harris. Mean Joe Green will be the first to say it. The Pittsburgh Steelers' history was before Franco, they couldn't win anything. And of course, after Franco, they hadn't won anything since. Now, that has since changed, of course, but it took them about 20 plus years to do it. The Steelers did not win a championship. Franco was actually ran out of Pittsburgh by this Steeler organization. And in fact, for many years, Franco Harris would not come back to Pittsburgh. He was very upset, and rightfully so, at the Steeler organization. Franco Harris' last season with the Steelers was 1983. For those who don't know, he actually finished up as a Seattle Seahawk in 1984, and he was lackluster at best for the Seahawks. He really was. But of course, during his Steeler run, Franco Harris maintained he was the best running back in Pittsburgh Steeler history. We know what Franco did with the Immaculate Reception. We know what he did as far as his, not just his regular season, but his postseason. The very first Super Bowl the Pittsburgh Steelers played and won in, Franco Harris was the MVP. Franco Harris, even today, still holds many Super Bowl records. That's how great a running back Franco Harris was. And when it was money time, you couldn't have asked for a better running back than Franco Harris, number 32. So he will definitely be a part of Steeler history from now on in. We know that. I've already mentioned John Stallworth. You know I have to mention my guy, Lynn Swann, out of USC. Lynn Swann from 1980, my goodness. From 1975 to 1978, Lynn Swann was the best wide receiver in all of pro football. You can talk about anybody you want. The only other guy that could say that they were the best wide receiver in football that played for the Pittsburgh Steelers was Antonio Brown. Antonio Brown was outstanding. Now, he did have the meltdown. We all know this. But Lynn Swann was the very best. He was the cream of the crop. And as great as John Stallworth was, as great as Hines Ward was, and all those guys, and the fact that Hines Ward did not make the Hall of Fame is an absolute joke again. But let's face it, Lynn Swann was the best. Nobody ever said that about those guys, outside of Swann and Antonio Brown. And that's a fact. You can book it. When you look at, of course, I mentioned Mel Blount, the Mel Blount rule. Of course, we've had other Steeler Hall of Famers, such as Rod Woodson, Jerome Bettis. You look at, well, I know Troy Polamalu is Samoan, but as as Paul Mooney would say, that's Samoan ninjas. So if you want to include Troy there, that's fine. But the Steelers have had look at James Harrison, Big Game James. I'm going to mention a guy, even though he did not last long as a Steeler. I have to mention Jefferson Street Joe Gilliam. Because for a brief moment, he was the starting quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1974 when the dynasty started. And Joe Gilliam, if he didn't destroy his life with heroin, would have been probably right there with all the great quarterbacks, because he was a trendsetter. And he was the first legitimate black starting quarterback in the modern day NFL. Without Jefferson Street Joe Gilliam, there is no Slash Cordell Stewart. There's no Michael Vick. There's no Warren Moon. There's no Randall Cunningham. How he's not in the Hall of Fame is an absolute disgrace. There's no Lamar Jackson, of course, and several other black quarterbacks. So I would be remiss if I did not mention Jefferson Street Joe Gilliam. Because for a brief time, he had the smoothest release this side of Broadway Joe Namath. If you look at Dan Marino's release, it's very similar. Very smooth. And Joe Gilliam could spin that football. And we know what Terry Bradshaw became. And Terry Bradshaw would be the first to admit that that was actually his best friend on the team, which is rare in quarterback competition. But I had to mention him as well when it comes to Steeler history and when it comes to Steeler black history. Because if I didn't, I would be remiss to do so. The same way with Bill Nunn. Of course, Antonio Brown of the more modern day Steelers was an all-pro as well. Le'Veon Bell, I can't leave him out. I mean, the Steelers have had their share of great players. There's no question about that. We know that. And I also have to mention our coach, our ex-coach, Mike Tomlin, who stepped down this year. I can't leave him out. I understand that the way that he left was totally different from the way he started, but I have to be fair. He was a model of consistency and kept the Steelers very relevant and had to do a tough job in winning football games without Big Ben. They talk about how he only won the championship with with Bill Cowher's players. But he also got more out of Bill Cowher's players than Bill did. I mean, let's be fair. The best years of Ben Roethlisberger's career were under Mike Tomlin, not Bill Cowher. Mike Tomlin got more out of Troy Polamalu than Bill Cowher did. James Harrison played better football under Mike Tomlin than he ever did for Bill Cowher. He barely saw the field with Bill Cowher, which is why he looks like a clown talking about how James Harrison is talking about Mike Tomlin now. It's an absolute disgrace, but I digress. Mike Tomlin, very, very big as far as Steelers history. Omar Khan now is the general manager. We will see what he does in a couple of months with the draft. Right now, his record is incomplete as far as I'm concerned. He's done a terrible job in drafting so far. And that's just my opinion. At best, I would give him an incomplete. At best. Because he failed with Broderick Jones. Broderick Jones is an F. Terrible tackle. He's done nothing for the Steelers. Now, the guard that we got was very good, and the center we got is pretty good. So, but outside of that, he's done a poor job of, as far as even his talent evaluation, his moves. He's done a terrible job at the receiver position. I'm very underwhelmed so far with Omar Khan. But that being said, he is a part of history. He's a part of our Black history, especially being the GM of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, I understand it's not an easy feat, but that's why he gets paid the big bucks. And I know I could go even deeper as far as Black History Month when it comes to the Steelers, because I can think of glue guys like Robin Cole, Dirt Winston, J.T. Thomas. I can't forget those guys as well. The Dwayne Woodruffs, the Carnell Lakes, the Willie Williamses, the Dwayne Woodruffs. And this leads me in to, and I understand it is Black History Month. In fact, the end of Black History Month very shortly. But I can't talk about Steelers history, period, without talking about the great Mike Wagner. And he's a guy who gets lost in the sauce because there's so many Steeler Hall of Famers. But it takes glue guys to win championships. Franco Harris is not Franco Harris without Rocky Bleier leading the way for him. Terry Bradshaw doesn't get the protection that he needs without Mike Webster at center. Or John Kolb at left tackle. Probably the most underrated left tackle in all of football history. How he's not in the Hall of Fame is an absolute joke. The Steelers secondary doesn't do what it does without Mike Wagner, who was the strong safety before Donnie Shell. Mike Wagner hit hard. He was cerebral. He was never out of position. And he was a classy man. He was the epitome of what Steeler football was all about. He was one of my guys growing up watching the Steelers. And he passed away on Wednesday at the age of 76. You know, I was a kid when I became a Steeler fan. I was able to see Lynn Swann fly through the air. And I was like, damn, I would love to be a Pittsburgh Steeler. I would love to be like Lynn Swann. When I saw Franco Harris, you know, a lot of people like to criticize Franco Harris. Oh, he would run out of bounds, this, that, and the third. If you needed if it was 4th and inches and you need that tough yard, he wasn't tiptoeing. Franco Harris ran like a Mack truck when he needed that. And I figured, you know what? Let me try and be a running back like Franco. Now, obviously, I could do neither one of those things. But he gave you a reason Those guys gave you a reason to watch. They gave you a reason to be a Pittsburgh Steeler fan because they have guys like Webster, Franco, Lynn Swann, Stallworth. All those guys handled themselves with class and dignity. And even crazy Terry Bradshaw at times. I mean, I know he's had his issues, but he never once threw a teammate under the bus, which is more than I can say for Big Ben Grapelessberger. But I digress. My thing also is those Steelers are now, a lot of those Steelers from the Steel Curtain era are no longer with us anymore. Mean Joe Green is the last surviving member of the Steel Curtain. That's a humbling thought. That's a humbling fact. Even Steve Furness, his backup is gone. Think about it. Of the four guys, only Mean Joe Green is still alive. LC is gone. Never got a chance to. In fact, he's still not in the Hall of Fame. Again, a joke. Ernie Holmes is gone. Dwight White's gone. Now Mike Wagner's gone. Franco's gone. Sam Davis is gone. A lot of those guys are no longer with us. Mike Wagner will never be forgotten with real Steeler fans. And his legacy will always be intact. Do you know that Mike Wagner has more interceptions than Troy Polamalu? He played less years in a league that was far from the pass-happy league that Polamalu played in. I mean, think about that for a minute. Donnie Shell and Mike Wagner have more interceptions than Troy Polamalu. I'm not saying they're better, but the facts are the facts. And listen, Troy is a once-in-a-lifetime type football player. I'm not knocking him at all. And he was asked to do more than those guys were asked to do. I have to be fair on that. Because he blitzed more, maybe not more than Shell, but he blitzed more than Wagner did. But those guys, that lets you know how great those guys were. And how great the Steeler team was back in those days. And I just want to say, first off, rest in paradise, Mr. Wagner. And secondly, thank you so much for all the great memories that you gave this young man as a kid. And for carrying on the legacy of the black and gold as you got older and carrying it with grace and dignity and class, the way the Steelers should be. With the way Swann and Stallworth carry it even now. The way Mel Blount, who looks like he could still knock somebody's head off. Even Crazy Terry. I know Terry's a little crazy sometimes. And sometimes on Fox, you want to be like, oh my gosh, Terry, will you stop it? And I don't always agree with Terry from time to time. But he gave me a lot of thrills. And he's been upfront and honest about his fight with mental health. And he's probably saved a bunch of lives, not even realizing that he's done so. So I want to thank all those Steeler heroes from my past and from my childhood. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, UncleClaude signing out. I'd like to thank Misunderstood. Thank you so much for always being there. 420 Virgo, thank you also. I want to thank all those in the clouds, all those in the bushes. UncleClaude signing out, ladies and gentlemen. Take care. Stay safe. And God bless. And thank you, Mr. Mike Wagner, for a job well done. Pittsburgh Steelers for life.